Hi booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be going through the books that I finished in February and the books that I'm planning to read in March. I was a bit hesitant about the month there. I wasn't sure exactly where in the year we are. but February was a pretty good reading month. I finished about 8 books, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. Which is good for me, particularly considering that it's quite a short month as well. I've already talked about a number of the books that I finished in a random reading update that I posted a couple of weeks ago, and so I'll go quickly through the books that I've already covered, and then I'll go into a bit more detail when it comes to the books that I've read since then. So the first one I've got here that I've already talked about is Stevie Smith, a selection. Stevie Smith was a poet and novelist and I suppose illustrator, very quirky and odd, but there does seem to be often a sort of philosophical or sometimes sort of religious bent behind what she's saying, but it's that sort of weird quirkiness that the illustration, like the one on the cover, seems to suggest that stays with you, and also, like the illustration suggests, there's a bit of a darker side. Unfortunately, there are a few poems that I quite liked. However, most of it didn't really stick with me. So I don't think I'll be keeping that copy, since most of the poems that stuck with me I already have in other anthologies and things. Then next up we've got A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos, the first book of her Mirror Visitor series, and I'm hoping to keep going with this series. I enjoyed it. It's really interesting. About a world that's fractured into these various societies that are called arcs, and our main character Ophelia has been promised to in marriage to someone from this distant polar arc, and their ways are very different, and it's a society that's full of backbiting and assassination and gossip, and it's very different to the world that she's used to back at home. And there's obviously, with a book like this, it's sort of YA fantasy. It's there's magic and stuff like that as well, and it's really interesting, and I've been enjoying it, and so I'm hoping to carry on with that series as the year goes on. I also read The Woman Who Borrowed Memories and some other stories by Tove Jansson, some short stories by Tove Jansson, and they're on the whole really very good. I was saying in the reading update that I gave that, particularly when it comes to things like obsession, I think she does really, really well. There's a story in here called The Locomotive about someone who's obsessed with trains that I thought was really good. And another that I think the standout story for me is called The Garden of Eden, about a woman who's gone on holiday, and she's supposed to be going on holiday with some relatives, but there was a family emergency, so she's turned up there and she's alone. And I think it's somewhere like Mallorca or maybe it's somewhere in Spain. I can't remember exactly where, but there's this sort of expat community of Americans and English people who are sort of backbiting, and there are these 2 women who are threatening to kill each other, and it's all about understanding why. And it's as much about the personality of that main character who's encountering all of this initially as it is about the situation that they found themselves in. So I enjoyed that story and many of the others. And then the next one I've already talked about was Shoulder Tap by Maurice Riordan. A fairly solid collection of poetry. I don't really have too much to say about it beyond what I've already said. And again, I don't think there's that much in the reading update. And then in February, there's a great reading event called Holmes is Where the Heart Is, where we read the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes stories. I wasn't really following the exact prompts for the event, but I read the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and I read The Sign of Four. I think I'd already talked about the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes in the reading update that I gave, but I did also read the Sign of Four on my Kindle, which on the whole I really enjoyed, and I love these the Sherlock Holmes stories that have something, if only tangentially, to do with India, and I find it really fascinating the way that empire sort of plays into and influences these stories. And I couldn't help thinking of The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, if you've read that as well, which again is to do with India, to do with the treasure that's come over to Britain from the Raj, and about, on the whole, you have all these British people thinking that it belongs to them, and it's stolen, and there's a whole drama about it. But then ultimately, and if you haven't read The Moonstone or The Sign of Four, maybe don't listen. But essentially, the decision of the characters, and maybe the decision of the author, is that it shouldn't belong to them. In The Moonstone, it goes back to where it belongs. The Moonstone goes back to India. In The Sign of the Four, in The Sign of Four, it's if it can't belong to these men who are in prison back in India, then it can't belong to anyone. Is the conclusion that's reached by one of the characters, and I find that similarity between the two books quite interesting. I find it interesting that people were thinking that in the late Victorian period, at the height of empire, I wonder why, whether it just makes a good story, or whether there was something else going on behind that. I very much enjoyed The Sign of Four, and I'll certainly be reading much more Sherlock Holmes related stuff next February. I might go on and read some more Sherlock Holmes stories before the year is out. And then on to a couple of books that I've finished since then. The first I wasn't too impressed with, the second I was. The first is The Unknown University by Roberto Bolaño, which is essentially a big baggy manuscript of poetry that's largely autobiographical, about him struggling in mainly during his time in Barcelona, and that's about it really. And it feels a little too harsh to put it like this, but it did feel a bit vacuous to me. It felt like there was very little substance to these poems. There were some interesting longer prose pieces in here, and there were some, there were still some poems I found interesting and arresting, but as a whole, I mean, if it was only, and I mean, it's parallel translations. We've got Spanish on one side and English on the other, so it's about 400 pages of poetry. I could have stood about 150 pages of this, but not 400 pages of this. And so yeah, I'm not really sure it's something that's going to stick with me. And again, like Stevie Smith, it's probably going to be leaving the library. And then the last one then is yeah, a really important book, and a book that's really got me thinking. I read it with a commenter, with Frank, and it's Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. A book about, I suppose, the environmental issues of the 1960s, particularly when it comes to chemical spraying and these, and the word's gone out of my head, but these substances like DDT that are supposedly used to kill unwanted insect life and the like, and other vermin, and yet it often has untold consequences. It gets into the water, it gets into the digestive system and into the fats content of other animals, which then both with the water and both with getting into the food chain, it then ends up in us as well. It kills off insects that you don't want it to kill off, and other animals. It disturbs the ecosystem. That there are so many ripple effects to using these substances, and it was just really eye-opening. And even if, I think the ebook version and maybe a newer edition to the one I have here, they have introductions and afterwards that go into a little more detail about where we're at now and how the situation has developed, maybe what our own sort of parallel issues might be. But it's still good that I think Carson's main focus is on how these substances, these chlorinated hydrocarbons, and that's what I was trying to think of earlier, and the like, affect the ecosystem, and anything that is going to have such a drastic effect on the ecosystem, it's going to ripple outwards from there. You can't just, the example, another example that she gives has nothing to do with chemical spraying or anything, but when it comes to people not liking the fact that there are coyotes everywhere in America, not everywhere, but in certain areas, and so they kill off the coyotes, and then the farmers in the area suddenly notice an upsurge in mice and voles and rats and all kinds of other rodents like that, eating their crops, and it's because the coyotes were keeping the population in check. And you can't just remove a vital part of the ecosystem and not expect there to be consequences. I think that's the main takeaway for me, and that there are, when it comes to invasive species, there are less drastic ways to deal with them, to reduce the numbers. One that I found really fascinating was sort of artificial, what's the word I'm thinking of? The artificial sterilization of insects. So you bring up a generation of sterile male insects, within a species that's invasive in a particular area, and then you release the sterile insects into this really infested area, and what you're hoping for, and what tends to happen, is that the new males that are sterile fight off and probably kill the virile males, and then they try to mate with the females, and because they're sterile, then they don't have any offspring, and so then there's a reduction in the population, and that's a slightly more responsible way of dealing with invasive species and non-native species. But there are so many other things going on, like our reliance on single crop farming and of like single plantations. So with us liking these lovely symmetrical avenues with lots of trees that are all the same, when nothing like that would occur in nature. And it makes it so much easier for so many for invasive species, for diseases like elm disease and things like that to take hold. So yeah, it's a really, really, really fascinating book, and it'll be one I'm sure I'll be going back to. And I was glad to read it in good company with Frank as well. So yeah, thank you, Frank, and thank you for showing me how to do Storygraph buddy reads as well, because it works out pretty well, I think. And then I think that's it. I think that's everything that I finished in February. There are a few things that I'd like to get to in March. Well, actually, there are a few things that I'm still reading, so I'll get to them first. In terms of poetry, I picked up, I think as a sedative to Roberto Bolaño, a poet where I just had the impression that he'd have a bit more substance, I suppose. And that's George Szirtes. This is his new and collected poems. So pretty much everything that he had written up until the, I think, late 2000s. Yeah, so up until 2008. I think he's released a little bit more since then. And I'm really, really loving his poetry. Sometimes he's a little surreal, sometimes not. Sometimes he's quite realist and brutal. He's often very formal, but even when he's a bit freer in the form of his poems, there's still a feeling that everything is very deliberate and thought out, and he cares about how the poem sounds and feels to the reader in the moment. There's a playfulness and love of language in all of it. It's basically sort of everything that I love in a poet, regardless of whether they're writing in form or not. And also sort of meditating on sort of the weight of 20th century history as well, being someone who, as a child, he and his family moved from Hungary to Britain, and so the revolution that they escaped from, but also Europe during the Second World War and afterwards as well, is something that is not always the main focus of his poems. Sometimes it does come up to the surface, but it's often in the background. So if you like writers like W.G. Sebald, I think he's a poet that you would enjoy. So yeah, I'm very much enjoying this. I'm nearly halfway through, so he'll see me safely through a good chunk of the next month. And then the two ongoing things for me this year are the essays of Michel de Montaigne, and also, in a fit of madness, I decided to pick up another comparably big and chunky, expansive book, The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton. And I should probably read you a bit and let you know what I'm thinking of them. And it's interesting. I think I'm getting a slightly better but still rough idea of the general sort of schema of what Burton is doing in The Anatomy of Melancholy. I suppose it makes sense. It's sort of systematic in that way. Whereas on a reading session by reading session basis, Montaigne makes a lot more sense. And so I'll see if there's anything that stood out to me recently that that can maybe have some kind of resonance with some of the stuff that goes on in Anatomy of Melancholy. Have I gone past the essay I was looking at? I think I have. There's one on sleep that I found quite interesting. How long is it? Can I read the whole essay? Probably not. The thing I noticed with both of them is it's often hard to, or at least for me, hard to find exactly what they think about some issues because they rely so much on quotations, and I think both of them, with the exception of certain cases, tend to enjoy throwing up so many quotations to look at things from so many different angles, and so it does mean that sometimes it's hard to actually pinpoint the actual point they're getting at. I'll just read the beginning. Actually no, I'm going to read a different one. I'm going to go back to an essay on solitude, and I'll read you the opening of that instead. So he says, let us leave aside those long comparisons between the solitary life and the active one. And as for that fine adage used as a cloak by greed and ambition, that we are not born for ourselves alone, but for the common weal, let us venture to refer to those who have joined in the dance. Let them bare their consciences and confess whether rank, office, and all the bustling business of the world are not sought on the contrary to gain private profit from the common weal. The evil methods which men use to get ahead in our century clearly show that their aims cannot be worth much. Let us retort to ambition that she herself gives us a taste for solitude. Does she shun anything more than fellowship? Does she seek anything more than room to use her elbows? The means of doing good or evil can be found anywhere, but in that quip of bias is true. The evil form the larger part, or what Ecclesiastes says, one good man in 1,000 have I not found. Good men are rare, just about as many as gates in the walls of Thebes or mouths to the fertile Nile. Then contagion is particularly dangerous in crowds. Either you must loathe the wicked or imitate them. It is dangerous both to grow like them because they are many, or to loathe many of them because they are different. And so there's sometimes a bit of a snobbishness to Montaigne, which I suppose you can only expect from a nobleman of his period. But I do like that sense of. Initially it sounds a little cheap of him to be saying that really the world is just a place of exploitation, and so we should just stay away from it. And yet maybe sometimes a lot of us do feel like that it's better to retreat than to be infected or to be the same. But maybe he's set up a bit of a bit of a false dichotomy with the notion of a common weal and of self-interest, and that although the world is full of cynical people working for their self-interest, and that might make you want to retreat, it doesn't necessarily mean that doing things for others and being a better person, doing what's best for most, is completely out of the question. So making that distinction where I personally wouldn't put it quite as firmly, quite as decisively as he puts it. And then The Anatomy of Melancholy. I was just reading a bit of this before filming, and I was just reading a chapter. I'm still in a section where he's going through various causes of melancholy, beginning with judgment from God, which it's good to work out whether you're feeling sad because of that or because of something else. It's good to rule things out, I suppose. But it goes through various dietary things, various ways people treat you. There's a long section on the misery of scholars, and a wonderful section within there that's entirely in Latin, and both Burton and Montaigne both throw in random quotations in Latin, and both editions give you a translation of those little quotations. But there's this long passage in Latin where he is scathing against most of the clerics of his day. Burton was a churchman, and it's essentially riling against, I suppose, the Mr. Collinses of the world, the just the self-interested, cynical, to link it to Montaigne, careerists who are, happy to preach whatever makes them money, and happy to say or do anything, provided that it gets them into a good position, and so that there's no sense of conscience there, no sense of being in a position because you believe in it and you want to do good, and it's that self-interest, and he uses some very quite strong language about what they're doing for money, and that was just brilliant. But that's by and by. I just wanted to bring that up. But then there's this bit, just an introduction to a subsection on a heap of other accidents causing melancholy, the death of friends, losses, etc. And he starts it like this: in this labyrinth of accidental causes, the farther I wander, the more intricate I find the passage. There are many windings, and new causes, as so many bypaths offer themselves to be discussed. To search out all were a Herculean work, and fitter for Theseus. I will follow mine intended thread, and point only at some few other of the chiefest. And yeah, I just love that labyrinthine an analogy there. I think he picks it up a little bit later, trying to find where it was. I don't think I'll find it, but yeah, I loved that. Maybe just from reading too much Borges, I'm not sure. But yeah, I'm enjoying it. I'm maybe understanding some of it. We'll see. But that's The Anatomy of Melancholy. And going into March, then the big event for me in March that I love is March of the Mammoths, which was created by Jansson from All Blues Chapter and Verse. And the idea is you read a book 800 pages or more. You don't have to finish it, but it's, at least get your toe in. And I'm already reading 2 really, really big books. But I want to read something different for March of the Mammoths. I think particularly I want to read a big novel. And so my plan is, I'm about, how far? About 50, 60 pages from the end of the first part of the Anatomy of Melancholy. And I'm not too far, maybe about 150. Not too far. About 50 or so pages again from the end of the first part of Michel de Montaigne's essays. So my plan is to, at least in the next few days, really prioritise these two books. I've been trying to prioritise them this week as well, but I might prioritise them a bit next week as well, particularly Anatomy of Melancholy, I think, because I find it a little more slow going, to make up space then, and to put them aside for the rest of the month, to make space for my mammoth. So they will be going on pause eventually, and then I think going on from there I will be sort of piggybacking the two of them. So I'll focus on one for a month and then put it aside, focus on the other, just so that I'm not, I don't know, it feels very slow going, and sometimes I'm confusing the two, and so I think it'll be good. It's good to have the conversation between the two of them, but I think to sort of stretch that conversation out a bit, alternating between the two from month to month, might be quite good. And so let's get into March and my plans for March. It's already been quite a long video, so I won't spend too long on it. The book I'm planning to read for March of the Mammoths is The Strudlhoff Steps by Heimito von Doderer. This is a book about Vienna in the early 20th century, and it's translated by Vincent Kling. I've heard it's sort of to Vienna what Ulysses is to Dublin, and I've had this on my shelves for quite some time, and so I'm looking forward to giving it a go. So once I've got to a certain point in the Anatomy of Melancholy and in Michel de Montaigne's essays, I will get cracking on this. I think I've read the back of this before, but I'll read the back of it again just to give you an impression. The Strudlhoff Steps is an unsurpassed portrait of Vienna in the early 20th century. A vast novel crowded with characters ranging from an elegant, alcoholic Prussian aristocrat to an innocent ingenue, to respectable shopkeepers and tireless sexual adventurers, bohemians, grifters, and honest working-class folk. The greatest character in the book, however, is Vienna, which Heimito von Doderer renders as distinctively as James Joyce does Dublin, or Alfred Dublin does Berlin. Interweaving two time periods, around 1908 to 1911 and 1923 to 1925, the novel takes the monumental eponymous outdoor double staircase as a governing metaphor for its characters' intersecting and diverging fates. The Strudlhoff Steps is an experimental tour de force with the suspense and surprise of a soap opera. Here, Doderer illuminates the darkness of passing years with the dazzling extravagance that is uniquely his. And so we'll see how it goes. I'm intrigued to see that sort of pre and post-war thing going on, and so I'm looking forward to finally reading it. I've been meaning to get to it for some time, and then I said I was going to carry on with the Mirror Visitor books, so if I finish that book in time, I will pick up the next book in that by Christelle Dabos, The Missing of Clairdelune, and so this is I'll read the back again just to give you an impression. So Awkward misfit or misunderstood genius, Ophelia cares little about appearances. She possesses two special gifts: a talent for reading the past of objects and the ability to travel through mirrors. Her peaceful existence is interrupted when she is promised a marriage to a member of a powerful clan from a cold and distant ark. When Ophelia is promoted to vice storyteller by the ancestral spirit of Pole, she finds herself unexpectedly thrust into the public spotlight. Now that her powers are known to all, she is forced to reveal the nefarious plots that have been brewing beneath the golden rafters of City Celeste, and to throw herself into its political machinations. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It gives you a rough idea there on the back what the first book was about as well, which is always good. And then for some more poetry, I've got a couple of ideas. This past month I was hoping to get to the Conference of the Birds by Farid Attar, which is a sort of spiritual epic. It's a marvellous allegorical rendering of Sufism, the secretive and paradoxical form of Islamic mysticism. It consists of a group of stories bound together by a pilgrimage. The way of the Sufi is expounded here in tales that are often riddling and sometimes obscure, but full of incident and suspense, laced with quick character sketches and witty vignettes of everyday life in 12th century Persia. So I'm looking forward to giving this a go. Probably once I've finished George Szirtes' poems. If that doesn't take too long, I'd also like to pick up this. This is Bell's English Poets, the first volume, the early ballads, and it's it's an old book. Does it say when it's from? I don't think I can see when it's from, but it's an old book containing loads of old ballads like Sir Patrick Spens and things like that. It seems like a decent introduction at the beginning, but then each ballad gets its own introduction. It's a book I've been meaning to get to for some time, and I really quite like the look of it as well. So it's one that I keep facing out because I love the way it looks. But I actually like to read it. And then finally one more book on my Kindle, because I'd like to get back in touch with Historathon and read at least something else for the first quarter about the ancient world. And I would like to read Ghost on the Throne by James Romm, and it's about the fallout after Alexander the Great had died. I was reading Robin Lane Fox's The Classical World, which is a book. It's a massive overview of the classical world, and I can remember reading the chapter about Alexander the Great and what happened after he died, and just wishing he'd gone into more detail. And this is that book. This is more detail about what happened after Alexander the Great died. That one I'll hope to get to if there's any time, probably towards the end of the month, but we'll see. Might be one I just dip into, but we'll see how it goes. So there we go. Sorry for yet another long and brambly video, but I hope that there was at least something in there that you found interesting, and I hope that you've had a good February, and that there are lots of good things ahead of you for March. So for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.